Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Very happy to welcome you all to the Indo-Pacific Centre's webinar on cybercrime and security, the state of play in the Indo-Pacific. We are very happy and pleased to bring you this second webinar in our series on cybersecurity, and we have an eminent lineup of speakers with us today for what I'm sure will be a very productive and informative session. Our webinar today is held in collaboration with public policy partner, the Howard Baker Forum, and our global technology partner, DXC Technology. So for those of you who may not know, the Howard Baker Forum was founded by a former Senator, Howard Baker, in Washington, D.C., to provide a platform for examining specific and very critical issues, both domestically and abroad. The president of the Howard Baker Forum is with us today, Mr. Scott Campbell, and he has been instrumental in helping us put together this series on cybersecurity for you all today. I would also like to take this moment to introduce, after Scott, Bill Deckelman, who's the Executive Vice President and General Counsel for DXC Technology, and who's also been a great support for this cyber program, as well as the whole Indo-Pacific Centre from its inception. So with that, quick and hand it over to you, Scott and Bill, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C. in the early morning hours, and excited about this program, our second in our series, as Diva was saying. And our thanks go out to Diva and her team for putting together this program. It's very timely and important, as we all know, the second in our virtual series. The objective of the program is to bring to decision makers, both in government and business, really in all sectors, mostly the vulnerable ones, the latest intelligence analysis on the escalating cyber threat environment globally, but particularly in the Pacific region, Indo-Pacific region. And we certainly cannot protect against what we do not know, and it is important that we know the state of play and how it's rapidly transforming and expanding the threat. In the U.S., the state of play has become so aggravated that President Biden, as you probably read, has publicly warned President Putin against tolerating or harboring cyber criminals known to be working out of Russia. And of course, he says he doesn't know about this. Of course, that's laughable. If he doesn't know about this, it'd be the only thing that he doesn't know about in all of Russia. But nonetheless, we'll see how that works out. Biden went so far as to identify and give Putin 16 different areas of critical infrastructure which are out of bounds, or Russia will face retaliation, and we'll see about that. We have they call these, of course, red lines, and the U.S. record on drawing them is quite mixed, and so nonetheless, the stakes have been very significantly raised, and no better time than to be talking about that right now. We'll have to see what happens. Of course, we do know that cyber criminals are mobile, that they are easily concealed, that they have other venues available to them in China and Iran and North Korea and other places. So even if Putin were to crack down on the Russians, I'm sure the cyber criminals would just move someplace else. The problem continues with us. The good news is we'll hear from our very distinguished speakers, and we are very lucky to have them take time today. That's what we expect, a very aroused, very intensive defensive strategy and countermeasures throughout the Indo-Pacific region, and we look forward to hearing about that from our speakers. So thank you very much, Diva, and on the team. We look forward to a very informative and timely discussion, and I'll turn it over to Bill Deckelman. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott. And just a couple of brief comments here. Let me just add my welcome to everyone for this webinar. We're very pleased at DXC to be supporting the webinar and the Indo-Pacific Center in general. You know, we provide IT services globally, and so every day we see from our clients how really existential, you know, these issues are to them. Some of the largest global enterprises, some of the largest global supply chains, and certainly government agencies and ministries who count on, you know, stable IT services day in and day out. So we're very attuned to these issues and really are very passionate about working to make sure there's awareness out there in terms of how we deal with all this, because that's where it starts. If you're if you're unaware, you're not going to be able to address these. And as Scott alluded to, we all know the frequency and the sophistication of these cyber attacks is only increasing every day. So we're, again, just very happy to be part of this, and welcome everyone. And I'll stop there so we can get on with the program. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure for me to welcome all of you and to introduce our speakers. Let me say that I represent the Indo-Pacific Centre. I'm currently a professor of security studies at the Nanyang Technological University. And I would like to introduce as our first speaker, Brigadier General Irot Soni. General Soni is the current commander of the Indonesian Army Cyber and Crypto Center. Before that, he's had an extensive career in a number of fields, including intelligence. He also served the Indonesian Defense University, and he also held a very important appointment overseas. He was Indonesia's deputy military advisor to the United Nations. And with such an extensive background, a rich background, I would now like to invite General Irot Soni to speak to you about the cyberscape in Indonesia.
Thank you, Professor Mohan. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the participants of this Indo-Pacific Centre Cyber webinar. It is such a privilege and honor for me to be able to attend before you to give the first presentation related to the cybersecurity and where the state of play in the Indo-Pacific from the Indonesian Army perspective. Actually, I would like to start with that. We are now entering the new phase of the so-called information warfare, which characterizes the fifth generation of warfare. As it is also stated by our President Jokowi, that the war nowadays is not about conventional type anymore. It is a culture war. And be careful, we are facing the information war, in which certain states may become weak because of a perception. It is also strengthened by the philosophy of Chinese general Sun Tzu, the traditional general, where he said that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. And as maybe you may be aware also that at the moment we are entering the information warfare, where the information is becoming so powerful. So everyone or every nation or every entities that can secure the information, they can win any kind of competition or any kind of war. So this is the characteristics of the cyber competition at the moment at this stage. And from the Army perspective, that we try to design to strengthen our posture as well as of our concept to fight this kind of warfare. And we are starting to how we perceive the threat in our army, especially in terms of cyber threat. So we are focusing, there are two kinds of cyber threat, which is the cyber threat for physical and the non-physical one. It's more competitive one. So the physical one, that is trying to attack our critical infrastructure, and as well as our the so-called the information system of the Indonesian Army, and the non-physical threat is trying to attack the mindset of our army personnel. So in this regard, we have to design like a kind of defense strategy and defense architecture, especially of cyber, and concept to fight this kind of threat. And I would like also to say that I have also my presentation. Maybe if I can share with you that at the moment we are entering the fifth generation warfare. The so-called the network-centric warfare. Maybe I would like to share in my presentation with. Okay, while we are preparing for the presentation, I would like to mention about my presentation orally. The concept of the fifth generation warfare is about the so-called the network-centric warfare. It is network against networks, and it is characterized by the cyber warfare. And the identity or like the breakdown of the cyber warfare, it is also including the so-called fusion warfare and the IoT or Internet of Things warfare and combat clouds. All of these kind of battles, this characterized the so-called as the information warfare or the cyber war. And the reason why information is becoming more powerful, because the one who can master the information, that he has the power, and which means that everyone try to do their best how they can take the information as much as possible. So, and some of the other entity that becoming the target have to defend and this information, and then it's becoming the potential threat for Indonesian army as well. So this is the root of the future warfare. The so-called the C4ISR.
Communication, control, and including the intelligence, surveillance, and recognition. Yeah. And that's characterized the network-centric warfare and the multi-domain warfare and fusion warfare. And from the Indonesian Army perspective, the way we secure our information system, including our infrastructure, that's the provision of our information security, that we have to convince to provide the confidentiality, which means that information security guarantees access right to information to the owner of access to the information, and integrity, as well as, because my time is only 10 minutes, so I still have 5 minutes to go. And integrity and availability. So that's the way that we secure our information system to provide with the user, especially for our Chief of Army. And that's the provision that we have to provide with to our Army. And we have to see that the evolution of the situation at the moment, that we are entering the 4.0 technology era, and then we are entering the 5.0, which is becoming more faster. And then we are entering also the 6.0 in the year 2016 that we have to anticipate. And we have to formulate the cyber, at the moment there is a formulation of cyber warfare theater, the new theater. Maybe you may aware that there are 4 already theater: the land theater, Air Force, air theater, naval theater, and space. And now we are entering the cyber warfare theater. Yeah. And the cyber threat evolved into the conventional war, which means that between military of the states will face each other. And we are entering also the evolution into digital transformation and based on the IoT. Next. That's actually what needs to be secured, the critical infrastructure and the mindset that I mentioned before. Yeah. Next. That's the character of the 5th generation warfare, the network, combat cloud, multi-domain warfare, and the fusion warfare, the C4ISR. That's actually characterized our command center in Indonesian Army. Yes. Next. That's the kind of cyber threat that there are two kind of the way we design the threat is based on the non-military cyber threat at the moment is we consider as the non-military threat, but the hybrid threat. Yeah, but the core is how we secure our system from any kind of stealing some information, and also they try to influence the mindset of the Indonesian personnel. And this is the threat definition. This is the way our army define the threat. There are two kind of threat: military and non-military, and the hybrid. And now cyber, we call it as the hybrid war, hybrid threat, because it is a kind of combination between the military and the non-military, as I mentioned earlier. That yeah. And next, before previous slide, yeah. This is the way we design our defense strategy, because every government, they have the call to create prosperity, create security, and the national development. And the cyber security, it is the so-called the national security grand strategy. And the way the Indonesian army designed the cyber defense strategy, it is based on our grand strategy of national security strategy. And the way we have concept how we design our strategy is starting from the cyber security, and the next step is the cyber defense, and then we have to prepare for the cyber warfare. Okay. Next. And this is the how the cyber attacks that can influence like a state, then from the physical way and the non-physical way. Yeah. Next. Yeah. Yeah. This is the global cyber development. Yeah. Next. Yeah. This is the, as I mentioned, that the physical and non-physical one. Yeah. Next. This is the example of how the cyber attack toward the world's army. It happens also in Venezuela, United States, India. That's China and United States. That's the example. Yeah. Yeah. This is the we tried to, as I mentioned, that we tried to identify the threat based on the physical and non-physical one. Next. This is a kind of regional threat cyber incidents ranging from the phishing, ransomware, e-commerce, and we also have a top 15 kind of cyber threat, especially in the physical ones, starting from the malware, web-based attack, phishing, identity theft, DDoS attack, and cyber espionage and crypto jacking. Yeah. Yeah. Next. Yeah. This is the kind of cyber threat that facing the world, including Indonesia. Yeah. Next. This is the type of non-physical threat, the online media provocation, hoax mode, facts manipulation, especially during the pandemic era. This kind of threat is becoming escalate and getting bigger and more vulnerable for the people, and also especially for Indonesia, the army personnel in Indonesia. Yeah. Next. This is the development of our Indonesian Army Cyber Command and Crypto Center. Starting from 2017, the armed forces, we have like a new cyber unit. And on the 21st of April 2010, last year, the Indonesian Army Cyber and Crypto Center was inaugurated by our Chief of Army. Yeah. Because our Chief of Army is aware about the threat of this cyber at the moment. Yeah. That's the development of how Indonesian Army strengthen our cyber capability and our cyber capacity. And based on this threat, we have the concept how we develop our posture, is starting from 5 elements that we have to strengthen. The first one is how we strengthen our human capability, and second one is the concept, the so-called the SOP. And the third one, we are building our technology. And the fifth one is the community, because we cannot stand alone. We have to work together internationally and domestically. And the fifth one, if we are building the cyber awareness of the people, because we monitor that there are about 50% of the cyber attacks, and like the vulnerability is coming from the awareness of the Indonesian personnel army, because they are not aware that there is like a Trojan links coming to their phone, their computer, their email. Then they click, and then most of the information has been taken by the state or the non-state actor. And then based on the technology, we have the roadmap. Next, the roadmap that actually this is the overview of the Indonesian, because time is very limited. The time constraint. I would like to give like the glimpse of our organization, but I would like to focus on our concept, how we develop our capability. And this is the previous one. This is our concept of how we strengthen our defense, cyber defense posture and cyber security posture. As I mentioned that the roadmap for our technology and our military capability, or like a our main capability is in terms of technology, starting from the social media analytic capability with the social media intelligence, web intelligence, as well as the open source intelligence, and the digital forensic capability. And because we have to support our army to investigate any kind of criminal offenses in our army personnel. And we also to build the SOC, the Security Operational Center. And the next one, we are building our Cyber Command Center. The integration of the any cyber element, including the artificial intelligence, big data, clouds, and as well as the robotics. That's our next stage. And then the fifth one, we have to have the cyber lab and cyber range. This is for the training and education for our cyber personnel in the Indonesian Army. That's actually our concept, how we play our role in Indonesian Army to respond any kind of attack and threat to our infrastructure and to the mindset of the Indonesian Army personnel. I would like to end by saying there is like one adagium from the founder of our crypto. This is actually some example, but because of the time constraint, I would like to end my presentation with there is like the father of Indonesian cryptology, that remember that one mistake done by one person is enough to cause the collapse of the nation. I thank you, Professor Rohan. Thank you so much for the time given to me.
General Iratsoni, thank you very much. You have made a very comprehensive presentation, and I would like to highlight one aspect that you spoke of, which many others have not. You said that your efforts are directed towards also securing the mindset, because we have seen with online falsehoods and manipulation, we have to build the capabilities, especially to protect the thinking of our armed forces, of our security forces personnel, because foreign intervention, subversive organizations, extremist terrorist groups, they tend to target these personnel. And within the cyber capabilities, we also need to build those special capabilities to detect such threats. Please accept our appreciation for your presentation. There'll be opportunity for our participants to ask you questions. And we also want to not only thank you, but thank General Andika, the Indonesian Army Chief, for supporting your participation in our event. Let me now turn to our next speaker, Dr. Stephen McCombie, who is a specialist in cybersecurity in Australia. He is currently a senior lecturer at the Macquarie University in cybersecurity. I have had the distinction of knowing Dr. McCombie for some time. And I want to say that his specialty is cybercrime, digital forensics, cyber threat intelligence, and cyber conflicts. And he has worked extensively in this field for the last 20 years, and he has worked during the last 20 years with IBM, with CSA, with RSA, with National Australia Bank, with Secure World, and a number of other agencies. Ladies and gentlemen, let me now give the floor to Dr. Stephen Macombi to speak to you.
Thank you, Professor, for that introduction. Yeah, so just a little bit about me. Obviously, I've been around cybersecurity a long time. I originally worked in law enforcement in the State Police in New South Wales back in the 90s, helped set up a computer crime unit there, progressed into private industry and worked for a number of organisations, you know, that you mentioned, Professor. CSL is actually now part of DSC Technology, funnily enough. I actually used to run the Global Security Operations Centre, which was based in Sydney. And that was a really important time in my career because it gave me a great appreciation of the sort of threats that a company like CSC faces, being a manager, in services for so many organisations, government, military, intelligence organisations. So that was a really important experience to get that visibility. And I suppose my early career was certainly at the coalface, dealing with cyber threats and understanding cyber threat actors. And it really informed my thinking today that any good cybersecurity strategy has to involve identifying who your threat actors are, understanding what their capabilities are, understand what they're after from you, and build your strategy around that. In the end, if you don't understand the threat actors targeting you, you can never succeed. I mean, trying to secure an organization against any possibility is beyond the budget of any organization and impossible, and you will always fail. So certainly in my experience, all the organizations are successful in terms of defending themselves in the cybersecurity space understand their threat actors very well in terms of who's coming after them and the way they'll do that. They build their strategy around that. In terms of domestic cybersecurity in Australia and some of the trends we're seeing in our region, obviously cybersecurity is a bit of a global business. And just an aside, I'm actually about to take up a new role in the Netherlands as a professor of IT security at the NHL Stenning University of Applied Sciences. So nicely in my line of work, you can apply your cybersecurity experience anywhere. But I think a lot of things are global. But in terms of things that are probably more uniquely Australian, I'll speak about a little bit. I think we certainly have seen this wave of ransomware, which other countries have seen. There's a lot of talk about led government response to that, whether there should be regulatory or even criminal offences around paying ransoms, and that might affect those ransomware attacks. My personal view is that as a public policy issue, ransomware is a great problem because organisations paying money to cyber criminals are just encouraging them to actually commit more crimes. Additionally, it's actually in some ways probably illegal already because you're not supposed to pay money to an organisation you don't actually know. So we have anti-money laundering legislation in Australia, as many countries do, and counter-terrorism financing laws. If you pay a cyber criminal, and I'm not talking about individuals, I'm talking about large organisations. In Australia, we have the largest meat processing company in the world, recently hit by a cyber attack. They paid a ransom. I know the University of California, a government university in America, very, very famous one, paid over $2 million in a ransom. So these are large organisations paying ransoms, effectively funding that crime. So that's a great challenge at the moment. In some ways, to me, ransomware is a bit of the wrong issue. People think that ransomware is the key. To me, ransomware is all about the lack of security in our systems, because basically cyber criminals are entrepreneurs. They're looking for opportunities to attack. The early ransomware attacks were basically people that were going after bank customers to steal their passwords, found that they were compromising lots of systems, had no way of monetizing that, and thought, okay, let's use some technology to encrypt their drives and ask them for money and use cryptocurrency, which became a very effective way of getting money. So it's just an opportunity, an entrepreneurial opportunity that cyber criminals have seen. But the problem is that organisations clearly don't have the right disaster recovery or BCP. I worked for a bank for a long time, National Australia Bank, and one thing the banks were very good at is making sure but they had good backups of systems because they rely on those so heavily. It's amazing what major organisations, and you would have read the recent case with Colonial Pipeline in the US, which was a massive one. They did have backups, but apparently it was very difficult for them to get to them, so they end up paying the ransom anyway. But it just shows the vulnerability that we have. But the message there is, if we're vulnerable to a ransomware attack, we're also vulnerable to state actors who are trying to spy on us, who aren't going to tell us that they've compromised our system. They're just going to steal our information. And I think Australia particularly has been subject to many state-sponsored attacks on government and on industry. Our Australian Parliament's been penetrated. Australian political parties have been penetrated. Even ASIO, our Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, our CIA, has been penetrated. So many organisations have been targeted, primarily from China. That seems to be, that's the impression. The government's very reluctant to actually call out China on it for various political reasons, but that's the reality. Certainly, all the back channel talk from government is that it's China. At the same time, industry's been impacted. The mining industry in Australia was actually an early victim of Chinese state-sponsored attacks, and a lot of that was around getting information in terms of technologies that the mining companies are using, but also pricing strategies, because obviously, we're one of the biggest suppliers of iron ore to China, and those pricing strategies are worth a lot of money if that information is available. So that there were compromises around that. Those the head of MI6 actually said that it was more than $1 billion was actually lost as a result of that information that was identified around those pricing strategies. As you might know, some of our mining companies also in Britain. So the MI6 were actually involved in that. So it just shows you the scale of those sort of problems. So I suppose any country's political position is also going to be its position in cyberspace in terms of the adversaries it might see. So I often say to my students when I'm talking about cybersecurity and about threats in cyberspace is just an extension of the rest of the world. Things are done in cyberspace to actually affect the real world. So it's just another domain for countries, and generally they talked a lot about the military, and obviously it's very important to militaries, and I know the Australian military have focused a lot on their capabilities in cyber, both defensive and offensive. But cyber is just another domain. We can't think of it as something totally separate, because it's not. So one of the things around Australia is, I suppose, some of the ability of the government to actually build a structure for organisations to go to. Interestingly enough, when the original cybersecurity organisation to protect Australia was set up, a thing called AusCert, it was actually a private organisation run out of a university. Probably 10 years later, then a government organisation run out of our Attorney General's department. So essentially a law enforcement body was set up. Now that organisation is part of the military. So you can see it going from a charity to law enforcement to the military. And that's very much the trend in Australia. I'm sure that's a trend in other countries too, where cybersecurity has now become a military matter. So that's quite a huge thing in terms of how it's approached. And so the Australian Cybersecurity Centre is run by a person who's a former signals intelligence person, whose job actually was in spying on signals intelligence on other countries, but now is responsible for protecting us. So it's an interesting sort of situation to be. Now, that's sort of a bit about Australia's current situation. There's also a question there about bilateral, multilateral mechanisms to deal with cybersecurity. I think one of the great things Australia has done is sort of in the diplomatic space. Tobias Feakin, who's our cyber ambassador, does a fantastic job working with other countries around these sort of threats. A couple of years ago, they actually, when the NotPetya attack from Russia occurred, they actually got together with the US, the UK, Denmark, Lithuania, Estonia, and Canada for a joint statement attributing the attack to Russia. And that's really important in this space, that this sort of stuff doesn't happen in isolation, and we need to work together as countries in this diplomatic way to actually deal with that. Now, I appreciate we're probably running a little bit over time, so I might just give my time back there, Professor, and maybe you can come back as some questions later.
We thank Dr. Stephen McCombie for his comprehensive presentation. And ladies and gentlemen, we are going to have 30 minutes Q&A, and if you have any questions, you can send the questions on Zoom. I would also like to ask the participants to raise any comments you have. You can send not only questions but comments. And we have the first question is for General Sonny. General Sonny, you have a question from another general, General Roel.
Oh, okay.
General Roel would like to know how the critical national information infrastructure in Indonesia and whether defense, the Indonesian defense has a role in securing the critical national information infrastructure.
Right. Yes. Thank you so much, Professor. And General, I would like to give my appreciation and my best regard to the General. Yes. Related to your question, yes, we play a role in how we secure our information system infrastructure. Yeah. We have in our army itself, we have our information system infrastructure. Starting from, we have like the so-called the intelligent information system, operation information system, personal information system, as well as logistic. And we have also the national information system, the so-called when one national data system. And it, because of this kind of the character of this information system is they have like a connection among institutions. So every institution have the role to secure this system. And we have some entities in our national system, or like the how we secure this information system. Every because it is like have the interconnection information system between like Minister of Health, Minister of Defense, Education, and every entity they have to have the access to this kind of information. So every like in defense itself, we are comprised of like the Minister of Defense of Indonesia, as well as the Armed Forces and Army information system. So every entity they have their own way to secure the system. In our army itself, we have our own SOC, security operating system. We have the CM system and the SOAR, the orchestratic system. Then we have to integrate all the security system, ranging from the firewall. Then we have to have the our own antivirus, including we have our own anti-DDoS and anything like that. Then it has to be orchestrated in one system, the so-called the SOC. But in terms of the larger scale of threat and attack, we also develop our stronger capability to integrate like the artificial intelligence, and also the robotics, and then the clouds also securing system. And we have our and it has to be integrated and with one totality, the aggregation of all the capability coordinated. We have our national cyber institution, the so-called BSSN. It is the prime organization that coordinate all the security system or cyber security system to secure the national information system. this our national cyber institution also, or body, it has the responsibility to create policy, and it has the also the capability to make some kind of cyber operational capability as well, nationally. Yeah.
General Sonny, you have one more question. What are the supporting laws? What are the supporting laws in Indonesia with regard to cyber security aimed at mitigating the cybercrime in Indonesia? So to mitigate cybercrime, to manage the threats posed by cybercrimes, what are the cybersecurity laws in your country?
We have the so-called the electronic ITE. Yeah, this is the ITE is our like one of the, it is the law that it is conducted by our police, because something to do with cybercrime, it is the role of our police, and this is the electronic technology and electronic violation of this cyber law. Then you are subject to have like a kind of punishment, and this is there is the difference between the role of Indonesian defense or army and the police. The Indonesian army, we are only focusing for the Indonesian personnel, Indonesian army personnel. But these ITE laws, there's like a connection with Indonesian army laws, and whenever there is like an army personnel that violate this ITE, this is the role of my units to support our military police to conduct like investigation. But in terms of civilian, it is the role of the police to for any kind of violation related to this ITE, and especially the cyber law, something like that, or information law. Yeah.
General Sonny, thank you so much. Please stay online.
Yeah,
we have a question for Dr. Macombi. BSFI is regulated and they have to comply. However, other industry verticals are not so well regulated. How do you suggest we as cybersecurity organizations engage with healthcare, retail, etc. to start their journey? This is a question for Dr. Macombi.
Oh yeah, really the regulatory framework in Australia is a bit of a patchwork in terms of what it covers. Obviously, one of the big one has always been people that accept credit cards. So that's been a way in, I suppose, for regulatory agencies to actually ensure a level of cybersecurity in organisations. I think, unfortunately, because there is no overarching legislation for any organisation in terms of cybersecurity, it's probably kind of ineffective right now. And I think you see that in some of the instances that we see in terms of the successful cyber breaches of organisations who are clearly not doing what they need to do. I suppose one of the areas, potential areas, is the privacy legislation, because obviously most organisations have information, PII information that's defined under the Privacy Act. So therefore, they have to have certain protections for them. Unfortunately, I think at the moment the regulatory agencies are more sort of in a learning stage in terms of letting organisations learn. We don't see the massive fines that you see in the US or in Europe on organisations. So I think we're probably a bit of a step behind there. I think largely we've got a pretty mature industry here in terms of the cybersecurity industry, but having worked in consulting, often organisations don't see the benefit of it. But I suppose one nice thing about some of this ransomware events that are quite public that are happening right now is it's kind of it's reducing things to the simplest measures that any CEO can understand. So they understand that there's a threat there, that obviously they've got a fiduciary duty, a director's duty in terms of their organisation about protecting it. But I think that there's a lot of space for much more regulation around what organisations should be doing along a range of cybersecurity issues. But thanks for the question. Very good question.
We have another question for Dr. McCombie, that is, why does cyber security countermeasures tend to be static, rule-based ones? Why are game theoretic approaches not common?
I think the challenge is, there's often lots of great technology out there that can do all sorts of stuff, on the fly in terms of, seeing a threat and using, machine learning and, AI to actually trying to predict things, but no one's gamed actually let those things loose. So I think, even in the early days of intrusion detection systems, where they would actually, they called them IPS systems, intrusion prevention systems, where they can actually block connections based on what they thought were suspicious transactions. That sounded like a fantastic idea at the time, but it seemed to fail. I think the problem about automating most things is, unless they're fairly well audited and understood, they can actually have negative effects on networks. And certainly my experience has been for the victories using more adaptive technology, there's an equal number of false positives. I think that's always been the challenge. And I think one of the things which I've always encouraged is, and part of this threat actor oriented strategy is understanding who your threat actors are, having a really clear idea of what their footprint's going to look like on your network, and they're the ones you respond to automatically. Like a very small number of things where you have a much more proactive approach, but very much based on what the threat is to your organisation. The problem about turning too many things on is that inevitably you cause yourself more grief than you actually solve. And I've certainly been in organisations where they've done that, and they've sort of lived to regret that. And I think one of the great problems too, and every software vendor is going to groan when I say this, is there's too much strategic thinking driven by vendors, where they're trying to sell a product as the magic solution. In the end, software security tools are just tools. They're just something that cybersecurity professionals can use, and there should be more focus on people and process, and those tools should play a secondary role. Too often, things are sold as a complete solution, and I think that's a snake oil. Thank you.
I want to thank Dr. McCombie for that comprehensive response. Now we have a comment from Scott Campbell from Washington, D.C. Scott.
Well, thank you, Ron. This is more of a question to our two speakers, but it seems like here, at least here in the United States, we avoid talking about retaliation, and it's all about penalizing the victims or having better backup systems or whatever, all of which is true, of course. But my question, I guess, is now that President Biden has threatened President Putin, we'll see how viable that threat really is, whether it makes any difference. Are we at a turning point, and can we expect governments now to start considering retaliation, or are they too worried about escalation and where it takes us? Thank you.
Retaliation is a really interesting question, and it's something that's often raised in this space about what's the right response to these types of attacks. I know when the initial attacks by Iran on the US banking sector, I'm just trying to pick back the year, it was probably in the like about 2012. There was a lot of discussion about the US government actually taking offensive action against Iran in cyberspace. But I think Barack Obama basically decided that was just part of the background, and they just had to wear that. They could complain, and they could take diplomatic measures and other things, but it wasn't really enough them to actually respond. But when North Korea hacked Sony and there were threats to life, you know, that the movie The Interview, he felt that crossed the boundary. So I think it's an interesting question for leaders. You know, certainly Barack Obama was like very early to the space in terms of these sort of decisions. I know George Bush too was also involved with some decisions around Stuxnet with Iran. But it's an interesting development in terms of what's the right response. But you know, countries like Israel, Hamas did a cyber attack on some infrastructure in Israel about a year ago, and the Israelis identified the building the Hamas were operating out of in the Gaza, and they bombed it. So there's all sorts of responses possible. So it's a really challenging area. There's some really interesting stuff done by the US Navy talking about different types of attacks and what the proportionate response would be. I think they're still working these things up. I think it's interesting that certainly back when Stuxnet was released, the use of a cyber attack by the US was considered the same as using a nuclear weapon. So it had the same sort of authorities around it. It's a lot less that now, but I think they're still sort of learning what's the right, how do you use cyber weapons offensively to respond, not just to cyber attacks, but other sort of attacks. And I know in Iran, you know, when there was some actual kinetic, you know, some missiles fired and some injuries suffered by US military, the cyber attack was actually used to respond to affect the Iranian military, their capabilities to actually do these attacks. I might give to the general. He's probably got some more expertise around this.
General Sonny, as Cyber Commander, you have your perspective. Please respond.
Thank you. It is very interesting question, especially related to the retaliation. Yes, in terms of how we design our cyber capacity and capability, we are focusing on cyber security first and cyber defense. So in terms of defense, then we are only protecting our infrastructure as well as of the mindset of Indonesian Army personnel. So the way we securing our Army personnel, we are not conducting like on offense at this stage, because as I mentioned earlier, that the way we design our cyber capability is starting from cyber security, and it is more to the preventive and protection and cyber defense. And the next stage will be preparing for the cyber warfare, but it is not regulated yet in our doctrine, because we have to work based on doctrine. In terms of Indonesian Armed Forces, Indonesian Army, our doctrine is more to the conventional warfare, fighting the physically. But related to cyber doctrine, we are starting designing this, how we should respond to any kind of threat or attack, something like that. But at the moment, our focusing is only how to defense and to protect our critical infrastructure, and as well as the information system infrastructure, and including the mindset of the people. We try to educate our armed personnel anytime that there is like a hoax or like hatred attack, and they try to, and cyber terrorism, they try to distract the mindset of the people, then try to entice the kind of, to take them to become the maybe like a terrorist member, and that's something that we have to protect their mindset. We have some SOP as well, and we have actually Indonesian Armed Forces, we have the code of conduct and we have the identity to protect the mindset of the people, that we are here is for our nation, and then we have the so-called the Pancasila doctrine. Pancasila, it's mean that our ideology of Pancasila, which means that despite of our diversity, we are one in nation. So that's why the Indonesian Army, that's our doctrine, that we are not easily to be influenced by any kind of other ideology that try to destroy the unity of Indonesia. That actually, at the moment, yes, the point is that we are focusing on the security and defense first, not to the offense base. Yeah, thank you.
General Sonny, thank you very much for your response and the spirit that you carry to defend Indonesia.
Yeah.
Let
Thank
me
you.
now ask Dr. Macombi one more question. What do you think are the main blind spots of financial institutions that cyber criminals are currently exploiting? Dr. Macombi.
I think the problem, financial institutions, even though financial institutions have always been good in terms of spending on cybersecurity, and you know, the Australian banks have cybersecurity teams that number in the many hundreds, and are some of the best paid cybersecurity people in the world work for banks. So they spend lots of money. The problem is they're very focused by what's happening today and not necessarily in the future. I think the problem with any bank is that there's lots of different financial products up there that could potentially be targeted by cyber criminals. And one of the big ones in Australia is our retirement funds, called superannuation. And they are largely unprotected because basically to date we haven't seen large attacks on them. Retail banking, on the other hand, which has been under attack for 17, 18 years, is very well protected. We understand a lot about the adversaries. We proactively try and trick them. We use our own, information warfare, you might say, information operations against them. We give them information which is false and we get them to use it, and that helps us identify them. So we're really sort of on the front foot, banks are anyway, in terms of respond to that. But we're sort of blind to other areas that are threatened, because the problem is, certainly in financial institutions, the people with all the power, this is politics within a bank, are the people running those business units, not the IT security people or even the CIO or the CISO, but these people running these various products within the bank, whether it be the broking business, the retail business, the superannuation business. So, and to get them to pay attention, it's very, very difficult because they're very focused on the targets they're trying to hit. So organizations like banks are quite divided in that sort of strategy. So, we used to have fantastic relations with our colleagues in the retail bank because, we were saving them money, but the people from the broking business had no interest in what we wanted to do because they weren't losing any money. So the good thing about working in a bank is the fact that, you can always see if you're doing a good job because your bank's not losing so much money. But the blind side is, and this goes to your question, is the fact that we're not thinking about what are the cyber criminals targeting next and how they're going to come for that. We're very slow to actually think about future threats.
Let me thank both General Irot Soni and Professor Stephen Macombi for their presentations and also for answering those questions. We thank them for their service in this specialist field and we wish them luck. Ladies and gentlemen, now we come to the last part of today's proceedings, and to do so, let me share with you that we have two very impressive personalities. One is Pei Ling, Miss Lee, and she is Assistant Director of Cyber Strategy and Capabilities Development at Interpol Cybercrime Division. And Mark Hughes, many of you will know him, remember him. He is DXC Technologies Senior Vice President of Offerings and Strategic Partners. So ladies and gentlemen, both Mark and Ms. Lee is going to offer us a first-hand information from the front lines of what they are seeing from each of their perspectives. Let me now invite them to take the floor.
Well, thank you very much indeed, General, and perhaps Ms. Lee, we're going to start perhaps just looking at some of the stuff that the Interpol are seeing, and specifically around the reports that have recently been produced. So perhaps we should start there.
Okay, so as Mark mentioned, we are seeing various threats that are targeting the region. So the report that Mark was earlier alluding to was a ASEAN Cyber Threat Assessment report that was done and published earlier this year. So even though this assessment was done for the ASEAN region, I think some of the trends that we see here are also seen in other regions within the Indo-Pacific as well. So based on this report, we identified some prominent cyber threats which continue to persist. So the first one being business email compromise. Such campaigns continue to be topping the charts, and businesses are suffering major losses due to such campaigns, because essentially for cyber criminals, this is a high return investment with low cost and low risk. Another one that I think very common is phishing. So especially because we're now in the COVID-19 pandemic, cyber criminals are actually exploiting widespread use of global communications on COVID-19 related information to deceive victims. Like, for example, they send phishing emails asking for your personal information by impersonating as a health officials, law enforcement officials, or they put up fake websites claiming to be asking for information for citizens to claim COVID-19 related benefits, just to name a few examples. Of course, ransomware. Some of our speakers earlier have talked about ransomware. Increasingly, we are seeing the healthcare sector and public institutions being targeted, as well as other critical and essential sectors. So, such as the energy sector, if recall the quite recent Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack. Then, of course, other areas include e-commerce. Definitely, that is because with the pandemic, people are staying home instead of going out for their activities. So a lot of shopping is tend to be done online. So that provides an additional opportunity for cyber criminals. Other ones include various kinds of cyber scams and even crypto jacking. Is one of the peculiar concerns that we see in the ASEAN region as well. So all in all, these are the threats that we are seeing in the very recent time. And these are the areas that our Interpol Cybercrime Directorate are actively working on together with our 194 member countries and in partnership with external entities, including our private sector partners under our Project Gateway, as well as other organizations, including international ones, to deal with these cyber threats that are emerging. I was wondering whether Mark would have any additional insights to share from your perspective, being from the private sector, dealing directly with cyber crime and cybersecurity issues.
Yeah, well, that's a great segue there into just that, which is, of course, when you put everything together, the thing that I am sure everyone on this call must be curious about, because in security we always have to be curious, is why, when we take what General Sonny talked about, the threats that we can see out there, when we heard from Dr. McCombie, from Stephen, about what's actually going on, what Pei-Ling has just talked about as well, is why, when we know so well what's going on, do we still get attacked? And it's a question, having been in many years, spent many years in security, is something that I think about an awful lot. So it's quite a curious situation. We know what's going on. And one of the people on the call asked about, some malware artifacts, and you can go to VirusTotal is the answer to the question. You can upload the malware there and access that repository. So we know a lot, but why is it that we keep on getting done? And when I say getting done, I see many organizations, being turned over on a daily basis. And as Bill Deckelman said earlier on, as an organization where we provide services to some of the largest multinational corporations in the world, this is going on all day, every day. So I thought I'd offer a few thoughts, because that, I think, is really where it hits. Now, I want to start by saying there is always a need for any organization when, back to what Stephen was saying, to understand what the threats are, but contextualizing those threats to actually turn that into an understanding of real risk for their particular organization. And I find that most organizations struggle with that a lot. They find that very hard to do. And I think the reason why they find that hard to do is something to do with what I'm going to say next, which is most of the attacks that we see are exploiting relatively weak vulnerabilities and are not sophisticated in their approach. So we have to move away from this idea that the attacks that we see globally, and certainly the ones that I'm witnessing, are very sophisticated. Of course, there are sophisticated activities out there, but mainly the criminals are exploiting relatively unsophisticated methodologies to be able to conduct the type of criminal activity that we see. And as we all know about criminals, many of you better qualified than me to talk about it, they wouldn't do it if they didn't make money. So they're obviously still making a lot of money, and they're very active because it's worth doing. And I think someone talked about the entrepreneurial spirit of these criminals. And that, I think, it takes us to some degree of understanding of what's actually going on. So what I would urge everyone to do is to start by looking at, and I know this is the boring part, is the MITRE ATT&CK framework and the MITRE DEFEND framework, newly published as well. Because that pretty well lists out most of the techniques that these actors are using against any organization. Now, I've already said there are those actors that work in the very sophisticated realm. They're fairly rare. And I think, as a previous speaker pointed out, they are by definition not willing to be noisy. They want to act and operate in stealth mode. And that doesn't mean in mass encryption and demanding ransoms and the like. So putting that to one side, look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework, look at the MITRE DEFEND framework. That gives you a very good view of what actually is going on. So I come back to the question. We know what's going on. We know what types of techniques are being used. We know what the potential for defense is. Why can't we get that together? So my starting point really is in answering that question that I've sort of posed to myself, because I think that is the rhetorical question that we do need to answer, because it's the one that is the million-dollar question here. Is, I think, the issue that I see is most organizations find it very hard to start to understand what they have in their IT ecosystem. And I think that's the main inhibitor. If you think about it, most organizations, and I will be slightly technical now, find it very hard to even manage or understand their assets. Their CMDBs, the database that holds the config and the management and just the assets in their organization, are often very complex, very out of date, very hard to maintain. It's a hard thing to do well. And I would say that to every organization that I come across. So it's actually quite hard to understand what they actually have, and then not only what they have, but how they're configured as well, and how they're run in real time. So that is not an easy thing to do. And the area where I see that this comes to life all the time is where organizations, our customers and many other people that I speak to, where they are making acquisitions and they don't quite know what they're getting until they've got it. And when they've got it, it can take them quite a long time to integrate and work out what is really going on. So it just goes to demonstrate that without being able to understand the environment, it's quite hard to then take the current threats and then translate that into what risks does that really pose to the organization. And without that understanding of risk, then it's quite hard to work out what a proportional level of control should be. However, and the good news, there's some good news in all of this, which is actually, if there are a few things that organizations do and do them well, they're going to be able to deal with most of the things that are going on. And I'm always curious to understand why organizations can't do those foundational things really well. And I think a lot of that is to do with how organizations are run, how security organizations are run within large enterprises, and just how the IT ecosystem is operated. Most large organizations outsource some, and to some degree, even quite a lot, almost the majority in some cases, of their IT operational management to multiple different vendors. And that in itself makes that problem even more complex. But back to my point about foundational stuff. Just a few things, slightly practical, but if just bear with me. Still, most organizations are not running comprehensive malware type endpoint solutions, workload or endpoint protection, antivirus, anti-malware, EDTR, as we increasingly call it. It's a bit more sophisticated than the basic stuff. But there is a lack of a comprehensive solution across the endpoints, and I put workloads in those endpoints as well. Fairly basic, and increasingly those things are now becoming more available in some of the well-known ecosystems that we buy into. Microsoft, for example, some of the cloud service providers have those natively in their toolkits. They need to be deployed and configured correctly and then monitored correctly. But still, most organizations don't have comprehensive coverage. Vulnerability management. And this is one that I'm always curious about. There are good tools out there that can be used to scan effectively estates to work out where there are vulnerabilities. And some of the things that Pei-Ling was talking about are quickly those types of vulnerabilities that are exploited to do the types of attacks that we're seeing are quickly identified through vulnerability management and vulnerability scanning, more to the point, just a straight scan. And you know, in fact, most of those criminal enterprises are using those tools against organizations to work out where they're vulnerable in the first place. There's nothing stopping an organization doing it to themselves, but often they don't. And one of the reason why I think that is often is the output from that is very, very comprehensive, let me put it that way. And there's a lot of false positives that come from there and a lot of investigation and hard work that's required to work out what's going on. So you can end up with a situation where a report comes from that with many tens of thousands of vulnerabilities, and bringing that down into something that is more manageable and then you can remediate from is hard. But again, most organizations don't do that as comprehensively as you would think. The source of employee ID and machine ID. And that's another thing. Again, many organizations don't have a good handle on their source of their employee ID. And I mean, a lot of enterprises have the main part where they operate from, but then they'll often have lots of other sources of ID as well, and those don't hang together. That's hard to work out how to deal with your IDs comprehensively if you don't know what the source is. Authentication. How do people or supply chain authenticate into an environment and gain access, and what type of access is it that they're getting? How many end users actually are there, including the supply chain? Again, most businesses don't really have that. What's the remote access solution? Again, increasingly, certainly in ransomware, the initial ingress point is some form of a RAS solution, VPNs and the like, that most organizations are using. And what access is there to the internet and how is that achieved? And how well controlled is that end user environment? What is the philosophy around the end user, right? Is it total management, or is it, much more internet based? And how do therefore end users get access to those apps? Are there some on-prem, and how do they mix the on-prem and SaaS apps? And then finally, just a couple of other things which we mustn't forget. As I think one of the speakers referenced, that the Iranian situation where DDoS came up again. We thought DDoS had happened and gone, and we now had effective tools against that. Well, no, DDoS is still there, and I see it often being used now increasingly in conjunction with other attacks to put yet another layer of pressure on an organization to force them to pay that ransom, which we increasingly see as the criminal way of doing things. And then very finally, increasingly we see applications now and those workloads moving in a very different way from they have been in the past, which is what is the real perimeter around those actual applications, especially when we look at a containerized world. How do machines and people access those applications, and what is the actual perimeter around that? And we hear a lot in our world about zero trust. Let's not get confused. Let's just be very focused on, back to my previous point, who have you got? What are their IDs? What's their remote access? And when they're accessing resources like applications, how do they get into those? 5 or 6 things that if most organizations did well, then they would go a long way to deal with the most of the attacks that I see. And I think, Pei-Ling, just one couple of final thoughts from me on this is, I think it was Stephen who talked about the security industry itself. We really haven't done a good job here. Most of the things that I have just spoken about, there are endless solutions available to deal with that. And I'm certainly not in the business of saying which one's better than another, because generally they do what they say, right? As long as you're not buying something that is completely rubbish. And increasingly inside those ecosystems that I talked about, there's some very good tools there that are available. So the industry has to switch, and has to switch from the challenge, which is not the tools themselves, it's to how you actually run the tools and how you make sure that they're effective. And I think that's incumbent upon organizations like the one that I work for, where we have much of a significant chunk of the world's infrastructure through the clients that we have. And we are taking at DXC a very foundational approach to those things that I've just said, which is, look, if we're going to run infrastructure, we want to know what the answers are to some of those things, because it's much about ensuring that we can assure our clients as well, but also because we have this collective experience where we see many different clients, and we can say, look, actually, these are those things that need to be done really well. I come back to to my starting point, which is there are those attacks that are in that bucket of very high sophistication, but the majority of what we're seeing through many of the reports can be mitigated quite simply by doing some of those things that I've just mentioned at scale. The challenge is it is hard to do that at scale, and it requires a prerequisite understanding of what you've actually got, what you're running, and relatively what's important in an organization. Get that right, then it's a relatively straightforward task to deploy all of those foundational controls straightforwardly, or get organizations like ours to do it for organizations which we do a lot of. So with that, I think just a couple of thoughts from me. Would you agree with that? Do you see that organizations aren't, if they did a few things well, they could be better protected?
Definitely. I think your insights have been really, really, really fascinating to me. And I agree with you on the point that a lot of organizations, they understand the importance of cybersecurity. They understand the need to harden their systems. But those, especially those at the management level, may not have the correct knowledge, the expertise, or even the commitment to be able to put in their resources to deal with hardening their infrastructure. So I think that's a very real problem. And in particular, if you're looking at such problems on a larger scale in large organizations, then this situation is actually exacerbated if you look at many countless small and medium enterprises who may not even have the resources to spend time, effort, or money on hardening up their systems. I think although just now I mentioned that based on our crime threat assessment, we see, for example, ransomware targeting the healthcare sector. So with that, we're thinking of like large hospitals or even healthcare services like we see recently in the case of Ireland. But really, if you look at other smaller organizations or even non-profit organizations, for example, perhaps organizations that are supporting the COVID-19 relief efforts, those can be similarly targeted. And really for such organizations or even smaller enterprises, what is in it for them, what they can do to better fortify their structures or protect themselves against cybercrime. I think that is something that is worth thinking about and exploring too. I don't know whether what are your thoughts on this, Mark?
I think you make a very good point about the how firstly organizations see the understanding of this. So I often come across many boards that I've interacted with where there just isn't the understanding, and there is a need to understand the detail here, and this is a level of general understanding of what is going on, education, awareness, call it that, which is, let's not sensationalize this, because the sensationalization of this turns it into something that means that it's special and different, when actually a lot of what we need to do here is relatively straightforward and needs to be done at scale. And even in many cases, my experience is some of those foundational things that the approach that DXC is now taking to embed a lot of that stuff is to say it's not that actually hard to do, in the sense that it's not sophisticated. It's more of a process issue. And most importantly, it's not necessarily that costly. A lot of the tools now are often there available. And so this idea that it's dependent upon big spend and big budgets, and that increasingly is simply not the case. And it's an excuse really to detract from the real thing, which is, do you know what you're running? Do you know how you're running with it? And then how do you put some of those things that are readily available to create that basic level of foundational security across an organization? And I think that stems from this understanding point that it's almost a virtuous circle of lacking of understanding in many departments or parts of organizations, plus then security teams that feel that they're not making headway in getting runtime IT people in those organizations to do the right thing, so then have to increasingly call for more tooling to be able to try and almost overlay. And we're in this cycle, which is just not effective. Otherwise, the criminals wouldn't be doing what they're doing and doing it, relatively frequently and often, sadly, successfully from their point of view. So I think that there's a lot of, and there's many who argue with me in this space, Failing, that actually we're the victims. So why should we do this? Yeah, but I sort of still come back to, if you know that you can do something and you know that you can do it relatively inexpensively, and you're dealing with things that you should really be able to deal with if you're running IT and IT is core to your business, which it is to every business now. Well, I don't quite buy that argument. You should just be able to do that better. And a lot of it is process stuff, especially when we look at ransomware. 9 times out of 10, there are backups, there's a backup regime and everything else. It's not often tested. And actually, when it comes to it, is it really tested in the context of if you're having to restore into an environment where you've lost some critical enterprise services, then that's where often organizations struggle to recover. And that then takes you immediately down a route of then considering a payment in a ransomware scenario as being a viable option. And you don't need to do many things to be able to give yourself the leverage, not to at least have other options available to you. So I think the understanding point is almost at the root of being able to do this better, because the irony is often a few things done well that aren't particularly costly, that aren't heavy in terms of investment, but do require a way and a thinking of how you do things, starting with that understanding, would change the landscape here comprehensively, actually quite quickly. And my very final point of this is, I know I've gone on a bit, is just this, is that we operate, as much as we're enthusiastic to operate new IT services and embrace new things and get better services out to our customers, we are, as well as everyone else, as many other organizations are as well, as if we could just show the same enthusiasm for deploying some of these foundational security tools comprehensively and really well, and get that done, then we really would then begin to see this real imbalance at the moment that exists in the low level, dare I call it that, criminal world, and against large enterprises, where there's this huge imbalance, where they have relative ease of being able to commit these types of crimes, and start to redress that, then the whole thing begins to change. I keep on saying there are those bucket of those more sophisticated actors, which will always be there, but let's not forget, in this scenario, even those very sophisticated actors are often seen either masquerading as criminals or using some of those basic techniques, especially on ingress, which criminals use as well. So let's not kid ourselves that in that, again, sophisticated bucket, it is all very sophisticated. Sometimes there's no need for them to be that sophisticated. So understanding, I think, as you say, is key. And last thing is that from that, when we look at the government and organizations like yours, like Interpol and others, how they respond, it's hard to respond to organizations when there is almost an abrogation of responsibility around doing the basics really well. And so I call on organizations across who people are on here today to really think hard about how to do those foundational things right the way through the supply chain, because I think that will go a long way to help. It won't deal with everything, but it will go a long way.
Precisely, Mark, precisely. I see that Scott has his hand up. I think you want to make a comment.
There we go. Yes, thank you. And what a fascinating conversation, and a somewhat hopeful one, I might add. But Nicole Petroff, the New York Times cyber journalist, and just came out with a book called "This is How They Tell Me the World Ends," about the cyber threat. Her takeaway, which kind of surprises when we were talking with her a couple weeks ago, from all of her investigation, was that the software industry is moving so fast that they aren't protecting their back doors. They're turning out software because they're in a hurry. Often they don't have a lot of money. They don't want to spend the time on it, and so they're turning out products that are vulnerable with back doors and access points that are make it very vulnerable. And that there needs to be some policy in the United States or anywhere where they would have some incentive to spend the extra time and money so they wouldn't be turning out software programs that are vulnerable. And I wonder if that's what either of you are seeing in your experience. Is that part of the problem as well? Is it the software that's coming out, is that vulnerable?
Well, Scott, I'll take that undoubtedly, right? There's definitely more that needs to be done. Yeah, there's always that very fine line to be had between, especially in our agile development cycles that we run now, and in our CIDC way in which we approach software and software development, about how much testing do you do, how much you test and retest, versus then how quickly do you get it out there, and then how do you modify it on the fly. So I couldn't agree more. There is definitely, you could say, is that balance right at the moment? However, the challenge with any software situation is that you're deploying it into an environment, an ecosystem, where it's only one part of that ecosystem. And being able to then to work out what may be vulnerable in that particular ecosystem is hard. And it's hard for the software vendor to be able to say, hey, I've delivered this piece of software. I think it isn't vulnerable to anything, and then subsequently it becomes vulnerable, and or when that is deployed into that particular environment, it is perhaps more vulnerable than it would have been otherwise. So, and of course, the criminals themselves are looking for those vulnerabilities, or at least if they're not considered to be vulnerabilities, at least looking for facets or artifacts of that software itself that could be used as a vulnerability. So undoubtedly, I think there's more testing that could be done. So the straight answer is yeah. But and also I think there is then the secondary point, which is that if and when things are discovered, the speed with which the remediation happens, and where some of that liability exists as well. Now we're seeing some such subtle shifts, Scott, now in some of the large software vendors where they're saying we can't do that anymore. We can't just throw it over the fence and say, there you go, people, you've bought our software, you run it, your problem, because it's just too prevalent, too ubiquitous. For that to happen. And there are a couple of those organizations who really have taken the bull by the horns now and are saying, look, we have to fix this, because they know what the blowback is potentially on them, not just reputationally, but from existentially for their own business. So I think there will be some more changes. Short answer, yes, more to do, but it does depend on how the context within which that software is actually being run.
If I may add, well, I echo Mark's sentiments that software vulnerabilities is definitely a concern, but I would like to stress that that's not the only part of the whole equation. From the cybercrime perspective, a lot of times, even for very large-scale attacks that we see, the weakest point are not just in the software, but in the people operating them. Sometimes attacks occur because people or the users do not adhere to very simple principles of cyber hygiene. Password is one area. I mean, really, we have to look at the whole issue very holistically. Sometimes strengthening your software, having it go through multiple tests to sieve out vulnerabilities is one area to make sure that the software that companies produce for cybersecurity do pass the test and are suitable for deployment in a way that is safe for its users or even the end customers. But really, I think from the law enforcement and cybercrime perspective, what is important is to strengthen people's knowledge about how they should use technology in a way that also ensures that they are protected from crime and the ever-evolving tactics of cyber criminals. It is definitely impossible for any software that is not vulnerable now to continue to be not vulnerable in the future because of how fast technology continues to evolve and how fast criminals continue to evolve, and sometimes faster than how law enforcement and the rest of the cybersecurity community can continue to evolve. So I personally believe that public education, educating the users, educating the public on what should be best practices in terms of cyber hygiene is also a very important step towards the fight against cybercrime.
What an amazing discussion from the front line. Let me express our appreciation to Mark Hughes, the President of Security of DXC Technologies. And let me also express our appreciation to Ms. Lee. Pei Ling is from Interpol. She is officer from the Singapore Police Force. And I want to say that she headed Singapore's police force, the Technology Crime Policy branch, a very prestigious branch within CID.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the compliment.
I think that both of you have done a remarkable job. And let me close this discussion by thanking Scott Campbell from Washington, DC. And also, I would like to express our appreciation to Madam Shamila Gunasingham from Singapore. And let me also thank Bill Decaler for his contribution for this event. Ladies and gentlemen, we will have another event, but I want to say that this particular event addressing the cyber challenges, cybersecurity has been a huge success. Many participants, much more questions that we have not been able to raise and answer. And let us continue to inform you of our next event shortly. I wish all of you good luck. Thank you.